10 seconds. That is all it took. 10 seconds for a 2,000-pound aluminum body car to go from a dead stop to 100 miles an hour, and then keep pulling all the way past 165 on a public road on skinny bias ply tires that were never designed for anything close to this. The driver's knuckles are white on the wheel. The rear end is stepping out under full throttle because there is simply too much torque for the tires to put down cleanly. One wrong twitch of the wrist right now, and this car does not slide. It does not spin. It leaves the road entirely. And the terrifying part is this was not a mistake. This was not an accident of engineering. Somebody did this on purpose, and when they were done, they had built something so violent that even the man who created it later admitted, in private, that it frightened him. This is the story of the engine that was too powerful for its own car, a machine built with so much raw power crammed into a chassis that was never meant to hold it, that it became one of the most dangerous, most desired, and most mythologized cars in automotive history. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why some engineers still call it the closest thing Detroit and its allies ever came to strapping a rocket engine to a bicycle. To understand how something this reckless ever got built, you have to go back to a small, half-forgotten British sports car company, and one stubborn chicken farming, ex-fighter pilot Texan who refused to accept that his cars were slow. In the early 1960s, a lightweight British roadster called the AC Ace was already a beautiful little thing. It had a hand-formed aluminum body, a simple ladder chassis, and it weighed next to nothing, somewhere around 2,000 pounds fully fueled. The problem was what sat under the hood. The Ace was originally built around a gentle six-cylinder engine that produced barely enough power to be interesting. It handled like a dream through the corners, light, nimble, precise, but in a straight line, it could not keep up with anything serious. It was, in the politest possible way, all chassis and no muscle. A beautiful dancer with no punch behind the jab. And this is exactly the kind of gap that history keeps repeating, over and over, whenever somebody finally decides to close it. A light, capable chassis with nothing to prove in a straight line, just waiting for somebody reckless enough to give it teeth. Enter Carroll Shelby. Shelby was not an engineer by training. He had been a fighter pilot instructor during the war, then a chicken farmer, and then, almost by accident, one of the fastest and most respected sports car racers in America. A man who had literally raced with a nitroglycerin pill under his tongue because of a failing heart, because he refused to let his own body slow him down. When his racing career ended for medical reasons, Shelby did not walk away from speed. He started chasing it from the other side of the pit wall. Shelby had a simple, almost stupidly obvious idea. The same idea that keeps showing up again and again in the history of fast cars whenever somebody finally has the nerve to try it. Take the lightest, most nimble chassis you can find, and drop the biggest, angriest American V8 engine into it that will physically fit. He wrote to AC Cars in England. He wrote to Ford in Detroit. And in 1962, the two halves of the idea finally met. A lightweight British body built for a small six-cylinder engine, married to a Ford V8 originally designed for family sedans and small trucks. The result was called the Shelby Cobra. And at first, with the smaller 260 and 289 cubic inch Ford engines, it was already shockingly quick for its size and weight. But that was only the beginning. That first Cobra was, in hindsight, the warning shot, because Shelby was not satisfied. He wanted more, and Ford, hungry to prove its performance credentials on the racetrack, was more than happy to give it to him. What came next was the decision that this entire story turns on, the single moment where a genuinely great sports car became something closer to a loaded weapon. Shelby and his engineers took the same lightweight Cobra chassis, reinforced it just enough to survive what was coming, and then bolted in Ford's monstrous 427 cubic inch big block V8, the same side-oiler racing engine being developed for Ford's assault on endurance racing at Le Mans. This was not a mild engine in its race-tuned form. This engine was putting out well over 400 horsepower, and in some of the most aggressive competition versions, closer to 500, stuffed into a car that fully fueled with a driver aboard, barely broke 2,500 pounds. Do the math on that power-to-weight ratio for a second, because the number is almost obscene for the era. This was a street car, at least on paper, with a horsepower-to-weight ratio that some outright Formula One race cars of the same period could not match. Here is the part almost nobody tells you when they talk about the Cobra 427, and it is the detail that turns this from a great car story into a genuinely alarming one. The chassis, suspension, and brakes were never fully redesigned to handle this level of violence. Yes, the frame rails were beefed up. Yes, wider fenders were flared out to cover fatter tires. Yes, the springs were stiffened. But at its core, this was still fundamentally the same lightweight structure that had been built around a much gentler engine just a couple of years earlier. Engineers were bolting nuclear-level torque into a chassis that had been designed, at its heart, for a car a third as powerful. The brakes, drum-assisted in the earliest cars before disc brakes became standard, were constantly overwhelmed. The rear axle, a simple live axle setup, would hop and skip under hard acceleration because there was more torque arriving at the tires than the suspension geometry could gracefully absorb. And the tires themselves, remember, this was the era before modern radial tires, before real traction control was even a concept anyone had dreamed of, were simply not chemically or structurally capable of transmitting all of that power to the road without breaking loose. The official numbers, even filtered through the same overly generous gross horsepower ratings every American manufacturer used in that era, were still jaw-dropping. 0 to 60 in under 4.5 seconds. Some period tests, with the right driver in the right conditions, claimed times closer to 4 flat. The quarter-mile disappeared in the low 12-second range. At speeds pushing 120 miles an hour, numbers that would still be respectable in a modern sports car built half a century later with computer-controlled traction systems and radial tires. In 1965, on skinny cross-ply rubber, with a solid rear axle and drum brakes trying to rein it all in. Those numbers were not just impressive, they were borderline reckless, and people found out the hard way. Stories spread quickly among period road testers and early owners about the car simply snapping sideways under full throttle in second gear. About the rear end, stepping out with no warning on damp pavement. About brake fade appearing after a single hard stop from high speed. Because the braking system had never been built to repeatedly scrub off velocities, this car could now reach in seconds. Several magazine road testers of the era openly admitted, in print, that the 427 Cobra demanded a level of respect and driving discipline that most owners simply did not have. It was not a car you drove carelessly. It was a car that punished carelessness immediately and without mercy. If you're starting to get the picture here, you understand exactly why this video exists. This was not a refined machine with power carefully matched to its chassis, its brakes, and its tires. This was raw, unfiltered aggression bolted onto a delicate British sports car body that had never been asked to survive anything like it. And that mismatch, that violent imbalance between what the engine could do and what the chassis could safely handle, is exactly what turned an already great sports car into a legend. Before we go further into just how far this thing was pushed, and trust me, what is coming is even more insane than what you have heard so far, do me one quick favor. If stories like this, the reckless engineers, the fearless drivers, and the machines that were built right on the edge of disaster are the kind of thing you want more of, hit subscribe now. It costs you absolutely nothing, and it is the only reason this channel keeps finding and telling stories like this one instead of them staying buried in old magazine archives. Alright, let's keep going, because we have not even gotten to the version of this car that Shelby himself was reportedly nervous to let ordinary customers drive. Because here is the twist almost nobody expects. The standard 427 Cobra that road testers were already calling dangerous was, in the grand scheme of things, the tame version. Shelby also built a small, brutal handful of cars known as the semi-competition and full competition 427s, cars stripped even further of creature comforts, running even more aggressive engine tunes, sometimes pushing closer to 500 raw horsepower in a chassis that now weighed barely more than a small modern hatchback. These were not really road cars at all. They were race cars wearing license plates as a technicality, sold to private customers and amateur racers who wanted the most extreme version of the formula, with almost none of the safety margin. The results on the racetrack were exactly what you would expect from a car this unhinged. Cobras dominated their class in American road racing throughout the mid-1960s. Embarrassing, far more expensive European exotics that were supposed to be untouchable. They took class wins and outright wins against Ferraris that cost multiples of the Cobra's price. And in 1965, in one of the most quietly remarkable achievements in American motorsport history, Shelby's team, using the closely related Cobra Daytona Coupe variant, built specifically to tame the Cobra's notorious high-speed instability at Le Mans, won the FIA World Manufacturers' Championship for GT cars, beating Ferrari at its own game, on Ferrari's own turf in Europe. It remains, to this day, one of the only times an American manufacturer has ever won that particular world title outright. But racing glory is only half of this story. And honestly, it might not even be the most dramatic half. Because out on public roads, away from the racetrack, where there were no roll cages, no fire suits, no medical crews standing by, this same engine and chassis combination was quietly terrifying an entire generation of enthusiasts and insurance actuaries alike. Stories, some confirmed, some closer to legend passed down through car culture, describe the 427 Cobra as a car that experienced drivers approached with genuine caution, a machine that could turn a moment of overconfidence into a serious accident faster than almost anything else on the road at the time. Insurance premiums for the car, when insurers could even be convinced to write a policy at all, were reportedly among the highest of any production car in America during that era. A quiet, unglamorous, but very real acknowledgement from the numbers people that this thing was simply too much car for the average driver. There is one more detail from this era that almost never makes it into the popular retelling of this story, and it is worth pausing on, because it explains just how far Shelby's team was willing to push things once they realized the formula actually worked. A small number of these 427 Cobras were built to an even more extreme specification, sometimes referred to informally as the semi-competition spec, essentially factory-built race cars with only the bare minimum of road-legal equipment bolted on almost as an afterthought, a windshield here, a set of turn signals there, just enough to technically qualify for a license plate. These cars had even less sound deadening, even less creature comfort, and in some cases, engine tunes pushed closer to the ragged edge of what that big block Vate could survive under sustained hard use. Owners who bought these specific cars were in effect buying a race car that happened to be street legal, and more than one of them later admitted they had badly underestimated exactly what that meant the first time they put their foot down in anger on a public road. And that, right there, is the entire secret hiding under the hood of this legend. It was never really about the horsepower number by itself. Plenty of cars throughout history have claimed big horsepower figures. What made the 427 Cobra genuinely dangerous and genuinely legendary was the mismatch, the gap between what the engine wanted to do and what the chassis, the brakes, and the tires of its era were physically capable of controlling. It was an engine built for a much bigger, heavier, more forgiving machine, forced instead into the smallest, lightest body Shelby could get his hands on, with almost none of the supporting technology that would eventually make that kind of power safe to use. It was raw aggression with the safety net removed, and that is exactly why it still gives car people goosebumps talking about it more than half a century later. The Cobra's reputation escaped the racetrack and the enthusiast magazines entirely and drove straight into popular culture. It became the car that action movies reached for whenever a director wanted to put the most dangerous, most visceral machine imaginable on screen. It became a fixture in car chase sequences, in music references, in the collective imagination of an entire generation, raised on the idea that this small British-bodied American engine monster was as close as you could legally get on public roads to strapping yourself to a missile. Original 1965 and 66 427 Cobras today routinely sell at auction for well over $1 million. Some rare competition examples pushing past $2 million, making them, pound for pound, some of the most valuable American performance cars ever built, a staggering outcome for a car that started life essentially as a dare between a Texan X racer and a handful of Ford engineers who wanted to see just how far this formula could be pushed. It is worth sitting with just how unusual that kind of crossover really is. Most race cars stay race cars, remembered fondly by enthusiasts, but invisible to everyone else. Most legends built purely on danger and speed tend to fade once the specific era that created them passes. The 427 Cobra somehow did neither. It kept getting rediscovered by new generations, decade after decade, each time framed the same way, as the car that was simply too much, too fast, too raw for the ordinary rules of the road to safely contain. Collectors who could easily afford far more modern, far more capable supercars still chased down original 1965 and 66 examples specifically because of that reputation, not despite it. There is something in human nature that is drawn to a machine built right on the ragged edge of control, something that respects a piece of engineering that never pretended to be safe, that never softened itself to make anyone comfortable. Now, of course, this raises the obvious argument, and if you know your automotive history, you're probably already forming it in your head right now. Wasn't the 427 Cobra just one entry in a whole club of engines that were arguably too powerful for their own cars? And you would not be wrong to bring that up. The 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda, with its monstrous 425 horsepower Hemi Vate stuffed into a mid-size muscle car body, became so notorious that some insurance companies simply refused to cover it, or charged premiums so punishing that most young buyers could not afford to insure the car they had just spent months saving up to purchase. The original 1992 Dodge Viper, built with almost none of the modern safety nets we take for granted today. No anti-lock brakes in its earliest form, no traction control whatsoever, and an 8-liter V10 producing raw, unfiltered power through a chassis that offered the driver very little forgiveness for a mistake, earned itself the nickname the Widowmaker almost immediately from the automotive press. Those are completely fair points, and if you want to make the case that one of those cars deserves this title instead, I am genuinely not going to argue with you very hard. But here's where the Cobra's claim edges ahead of all of them, and it is worth sitting with for a second. The Hemi Cuda and the Viper were both purpose-built from the ground up, at least in theory, around the idea of housing a monster engine. Their chassis, however imperfect, were engineered with at least some knowledge from day one of what kind of power they would eventually need to contain. The Cobra was different. Its chassis was never originally designed for anything close to what Shelby's team eventually crammed into it. It began life as a gentle, refined little sports car built around a mild 6-cylinder engine, and it was retrofitted, almost brutally, to accept an engine nearly double the displacement and multiple times the output of anything its original designers ever imagined it would need to survive. That is not an engine that grew alongside its car. That is an engine forced into a body that was never meant to hold it. And the raw, unresolved violence of that mismatch is exactly why the Cobra still occupies its own uniquely terrifying and uniquely legendary place in this conversation. Shelby himself would go on to have an extraordinary career, later returning to Ford in the 1980s and 90s to help create a whole new generation of high-performance road cars, and even collaborating one final time on later Cobra-inspired concepts before his death in 2012. But the original 427 Cobra was never really repeated. Production numbers were tiny to begin with. Only a few hundred were ever built, and the specific combination of circumstances that created it, a lightweight British chassis, an oversized American race engine, and almost none of the supporting safety technology that would come later, was never quite matched again, in quite the same raw, unfiltered way. Later Cobra replicas and continuation cars, built by dozens of small manufacturers over the following decades, would chase that same magic with modern brakes, modern tires, and modern suspension geometry. And while some of them are extraordinary machines in their own right, none of them ever quite recreate the genuinely unnerving edge of the original, because the whole point of the original was that the technology to control that much power simply did not exist yet. The danger was not a flaw. The danger was the entire point. So that is the secret hiding under the hood of one of the most feared cars in automotive history. A quiet British sports car company built a beautiful, nimble little chassis for a gentle 6-cylinder engine, and then a stubborn Texan with a bad heart and an even worse tolerance for slow cars ripped that plan apart, bolted in an engine built for something 3 sizes bigger and heavier, and created something so violently uncontrollable that even the people who built it treated it with genuine caution. It won championships. It terrified insurance companies. It became a legend precisely because it was, by any reasonable engineering standard, too much engine for its own car. So now I want to hear from you directly. In your opinion, does the Shelby Cobra 427 truly deserve the title of the most dangerously overpowered car ever built for public roads, or does that crown belong somewhere else entirely, to the Hemi Cuda, to the original Viper, or to some forgotten machine most people have never even heard of? Fight it out in the comments and keep it respectful. And tell me this too. What is the most terrifyingly powerful car you have ever personally ridden in or driven? The one that made your stomach drop the second the driver put their foot down. Drop it below. I read every single one of them.